Why do we sabotage ourselves even when we know it's killing us? Why does the addict repeat the same pattern? Not out of ignorance, in full awareness of the consequences. The problem we're going to uncover today isn't chemical. It's psychological. It lies deep beneath the surface of your conscious mind, hidden in the parts of yourself you've been trained to ignore. This video will expose the real cause of addiction, not as a weakness, but as a misunderstood cry for wholeness. And once we understand it, we can begin the journey toward true healing. At the heart of addiction lies not simply a craving for pleasure or an inability to exercise willpower, but a deeper and far more elusive phenomenon, a spiritual void. This void is not always religious in nature. It is spiritual in the sense that it involves the absence of meaning, connection, and inner alignment. It is a hollow space within the psyche, an emptiness that cries out to be filled. The addict is not merely seeking intoxication, they are seeking to transcend a reality that has become unbearable, monotonous, or painfully alienating. In many cases, addiction arises when an individual loses touch with the sacred dimension of life. This sacredness does not necessarily pertain to any organized faith, but to that deep, inner resonance that gives life purpose. When the soul no longer finds meaning in the external world, in relationships, work values, or even in oneself, it begins to rot from within. A person may look whole on the outside, but internally they are fragmented, disconnected, adrift in a world that no longer speaks their language. This kind of existential despair breeds a hunger not of the body, but of the spirit. And like any hunger, it demands to be fed. In the absence of true nourishment, love, authenticity, connection, self-understanding, the person turns to substitutes. These substitutes take many forms: alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, food, validation, social media. Each one promises a brief moment of relief, a temporary escape from the unbearable weight of existence. But none of them can fill the void. At best, they numb it. At worst, they deepen it. The spiritual void is not created overnight. It often begins in childhood when a person is taught, through neglect, trauma, or overprotection, that parts of their true self are unacceptable. They learn to silence their pain, hide their vulnerability, and wear a mask to gain approval or avoid punishment. Over time, they become strangers to themselves. The external self continues to function, to perform, to meet expectations. But the inner world, the part of the psyche that longs for truth and wholeness, begins to wither. Modern society accelerates this fragmentation. In a world obsessed with productivity, speed, and surface-level gratification, there is little space for introspection or depth. People are taught to chase status, appearance, and pleasure, while their inner lives are ignored or treated as irrelevant. The sacred is replaced with the synthetic. Silence is drowned by noise. Stillness is replaced with distraction. As a result, many live in a state of quiet desperation, smiling on the outside but hollow within. Addiction, then, becomes a ritual, not in the conscious sense, but in the symbolic sense. The addict engages in repetitive behavior, not merely to feel good, to feel something, anything. The ritual of consumption, of getting high, of returning to the substance, offers a temporary sense of control, familiarity, even comfort. It becomes a surrogate for spiritual connection, a false god that demands more and more while giving less and less. But this ritual is dangerous, because each time the addict returns to the substance, they are reenacting a deeper wound. A wound of abandonment, of isolation, of spiritual disconnection. The substance becomes both the cure and the poison. It numbs the pain but also prevents healing. It soothes the surface but starves the soul. And yet, the addict returns, not out of foolishness or weakness, but because they have been severed from the inner compass that would lead them toward true healing. In many traditional cultures, addiction would be seen not as a pathology, but as a spiritual crisis. The individual would be treated not simply with medication or discipline, but with ritual, community, and deep psychological inquiry. They would be asked, what are you really hungry for? What pain are you trying to numb? What part of you has been exiled? These are questions that cut deeper than diagnosis, for they reach the root of the wound, the soul's cry for integration. The modern approach to addiction often misses this entirely. It treats the behavior, but ignores the cause. It silences the symptom, but leaves the void intact. True transformation begins when one recognizes that addiction is not about the object of craving, but about the subject who craves. The fractured self, the wounded spirit, the disoriented soul. Until that self is seen, heard, and integrated, the cycle will continue, even if the substance changes form. The shadow self represents everything that an individual refuses to acknowledge within themselves. All the thoughts, feelings, desires, and impulses that are deemed unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. In the psyche of every human being, there exists this dark, hidden side, not inherently evil, but repressed. The shadow is not an enemy by nature. It becomes destructive only when it is ignored, denied, or projected onto others. In the psychology of addiction, the shadow plays a critical and often overlooked role. The addict is not simply someone who lacks discipline or moral character, but often someone at war with their own inner world, a world they have been taught to fear. Most people are conditioned from a young age to reject certain aspects of their humanity. A child who is told not to cry may begin to suppress sadness. One who is punished for showing anger may push rage into the unconscious. Over time, these repressed emotions do not vanish. They are driven into the basement of the mind, where they fester, mutate, and eventually emerge in distorted forms. The more intensely a person tries to disown parts of themselves, the more power those parts gain. What is repressed becomes what controls us from the shadows. The addict is often someone who has spent years, even decades, denying their inner truth. Pain is buried beneath smiles. Fear is disguised as control. Vulnerability is masked by bravado. On the surface, they may appear functional, even successful. But internally, there is a storm of unacknowledged emotion, unprocessed trauma, and unmet needs. This internal pressure builds until it demands release, and when it erupts, it does so through compulsive behaviors. Addiction becomes the language through which the shadow speaks. Substances are not just escapes, they are bridges to repressed states of consciousness. The intoxicated state often brings out the very aspects of the self that are not allowed to exist during sobriety. A quiet man becomes aggressive. A fearful woman becomes sexually uninhibited. A shy person becomes social and uninhibited. These shifts are not created by the substance. They are released by it. The drug does not invent a new personality. It dissolves the barriers that once imprisoned the shadow. In this way, addiction is a paradox. The addict simultaneously fears and longs for their shadow. The substance becomes both the portal and the prison. What society labels as self-destruction is often a desperate form of self-expression. The addict is trying, in the only way they know, to make contact with the parts of themselves they've been taught to fear. The substance becomes a ritual of confrontation, a dangerous dance with their own inner darkness. But without guidance or awareness, this dance turns into a spiral. The more they try to access what has been repressed, the more they are overwhelmed by it. And so the cycle begins: repression, eruption, remorse, and return. This cycle is not broken through willpower alone, because it is not a behavioral problem at its core. It is an identity problem. The addict does not simply crave the substance. They crave reunion with their whole self. They lack the psychological tools to integrate the shadow consciously. Instead, they attempt to fuse with it through intoxication. The result is temporary relief, followed by intensified inner conflict. The tragedy is that the shadow is not inherently destructive. It contains vital energies, passion, intuition, creativity, sexual power, righteous anger, and emotional depth. These are not qualities to fear, but aspects of the self that need integration. However, when they are buried for too long, they become twisted. Repressed passion turns into obsession. Suppressed intuition turns into paranoia. Buried rage turns into self-harm. The addict becomes the battlefield upon which these unresolved energies clash. Their life becomes a symptom of an internal war they do not understand. In many cases, the origins of this repression trace back to childhood environments where expression was unsafe. A child who grew up in a family where emotions were ridiculed, punished, or ignored will learn to internalize their feelings. They may adopt roles: the caretaker, the achiever, the clown, as a way to earn approval and avoid conflict. But behind these roles lies a reservoir of suppressed identity. Addiction becomes the unintentional revolt against these false selves. It is a violent attempt to reclaim authenticity, to shatter the mask and reveal the hidden face beneath. This process is further complicated by cultural narratives that vilify the shadow rather than understand it. People are praised for being cheerful, composed. They are punished, subtly or overtly, for being angry, sad, or vulnerable. As a result, individuals grow up compartmentalized, split between a public persona and a private torment. The addict is often someone who could no longer bear that division. Their collapse is not just a fall into vice, it is a cry for psychic unity. Within the depths of the human psyche exist timeless patterns, forces that shape our experiences, identities, and destinies. These forces are archetypes, universal forms that live in the collective unconscious, influencing how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we respond to the world around us. They are not inventions of the mind but discoveries, ancient structures of human experience that reveal themselves through myths, dreams, fantasies, and behavior. In the psychology of addiction, archetypes are not passive, they are active agents. They play out through the addict's struggle, not as metaphors, as psychic realities in conflict. The addict is not simply a person who makes poor choices. They are the stage upon which multiple archetypes wage war. These inner figures, the wounded child, the rebel, the orphan, the tyrant, the savior, are not imaginary. They are internal characters, each carrying their own desires, wounds, and voices. When left unconscious, they create tension, confusion, and fragmentation within the personality. Addiction is often the byproduct of this inner civil war, a coping mechanism for a psyche torn apart by opposing forces. The wounded child archetype, for instance, lives in many who suffer from addiction. It is the part of the self that carries early pain, unmet needs, and unresolved grief. This inner child does not speak in language, it speaks in longing, for safety, for love, for validation. When these needs are not met or are violated during development, the wounded child remains stuck in time, repeating the same emotional patterns over and over. The addict may appear to be chasing pleasure, but often they are trying to soothe this frozen fragment of the past. Every drink, every hit, every escape is an unconscious attempt to cradle a pain that words have failed to reach. Then there is the rebel, the archetype that resists authority, breaks rules, and seeks liberation from external control. This part of the psyche is not inherently negative. It can be a powerful force for individuality and freedom. But when the rebel is distorted by trauma or repression, it becomes reckless. The addict may reject societal norms not out of principle, but because they feel enslaved by them. Addiction becomes a protest, an act of defiance against a world that demands conformity while offering no genuine connection. It becomes a way to say no to a system that never said yes to who they truly are. The orphan archetype adds another layer of complexity. This is the part of the psyche that feels abandoned, unseen, and disconnected from belonging. Many addicts carry within them a deep sense of isolation, not merely physical, but existential. They may be surrounded by people yet feel utterly alone. The orphan believes that no one will ever truly understand them, that they must navigate life unsupported. This isolation becomes a breeding ground for dependency, not just on substances, but on anything that offers temporary connection or relief. Addiction becomes a surrogate parent, a false friend, a replacement for the love that was never consistent or safe. Meanwhile, the tyrant archetype may lurk in the background, an inner critic, a punishing voice that enforces perfection, control, or shame. This archetype drives the addict towards self-destruction by fueling guilt and unworthiness. The more the addict fails to meet its impossible standards, the more shame they feel. And shame, in turn, becomes one of the most potent fuels for addiction. The cycle becomes vicious use, regret, self-punishment. Repeat, the addict tries to numb the pain inflicted by the tyrant, only to give it more power with every relapse. Opposing the tyrant sometimes is the savior, the part of the self that wants to rescue, fix, or redeem. The addict may develop a messiah complex, believing they can save others, even as they are falling apart inside. This archetype can create a dynamic where the addict becomes overly responsible for others while neglecting their own healing. They may seek meaning in being needed, while avoiding the terrifying vulnerability of needing help themselves. These archetypes do not act alone. They interact, clash, and form alliances within the psyche. One day the rebel is in control, demanding freedom at any cost. The next, the wounded child takes over, retreating into despair. The person experiencing addiction does not always understand these shifts. They simply feel pulled in multiple directions, unable to find a consistent sense of self. This inner conflict produces a fragmentation that is painful and disorienting. Without a stable center, the individual becomes susceptible to compulsive behavior, not as a choice, but as an attempt to soothe internal chaos. The archetypes are not enemies to be defeated, but energies to be recognized and integrated. When unconscious, they possess us. When brought into awareness, they reveal deep truths about our histories, our fears, and our desires. Addiction becomes more than just a behavior. It becomes a symbolic expression of these archetypal imbalances. To understand the addict, one must look beyond the surface into this rich and tumultuous landscape of the psyche. Healing from addiction does not emerge from suppression, punishment, or moral judgment. It begins with the delicate and courageous act of integration, the process by which the fragmented self is brought back into unity. Integration is not about erasing the past or silencing the shadow, but about illuminating it, understanding it, and inviting it into conscious dialogue. Addiction thrives in fragmentation. Recovery begins when one seeks wholeness. The modern world often misunderstands the nature of healing, assuming that to recover means to return to a former untainted state. But for the psyche, there is no going back. The wounds inflicted by addiction, trauma, and repression are not meant to be erased but transformed. The goal is not to restore innocence, but to create maturity, a state where opposing forces within the self can coexist without destroying each other. This is the essence of integration, not perfection, but harmony. When a person is caught in the grip of addiction, their inner world is a battlefield. Desires, fears, memories, and unmet needs all pull in different directions. The addict may attempt to compartmentalize, to suppress certain aspects of the self in hopes of regaining control. But this only deepens the divide. What is denied gains power in the unconscious. The solution is not to suppress, but to engage, to turn inward and face each part of the self that has been exiled. The shadow, the wounded child, the rebel, the orphan, all must be seen, heard, and integrated into a larger understanding of the self. Integration requires more than willpower. It requires awareness. A person cannot integrate what they do not know exists. The first task, then, is to listen. To the body, to the dreams, to the symptoms, to the behaviors that seem irrational or self-sabotaging. These are not random. They are messages from the unconscious, coded expressions of what has been buried. Cravings, compulsions, relapses, all can be seen as psychic signals pointing toward unresolved wounds. To listen to them without judgment is to begin a conversation with the deeper self. This inner dialogue is rarely comfortable. It demands that one abandon the mask, the performance, the illusion of control. It requires honesty, not only about the addiction itself, but about the pain that underlies it. Many who struggle with addiction carry shame that predates the behavior. The addiction becomes a symptom of an already fractured self-image. The act of healing, then, must address not just the behavior, but the narrative beneath it. Who does the addict believe they are? What have they come to associate with love, safety, and identity? These are not abstract questions. They are keys to unlocking the patterns that keep one trapped. True integration cannot happen in isolation. The psyche is relational by nature. Wounds are often inflicted in relationship, and so too must they be healed in relationship, whether through therapy, community, or deep human connection. But not all relationships foster integration. Some perpetuate the same roles and dynamics that gave rise to the original wound. For integration to occur, the individual must be witnessed, not as a problem to be fixed, but as a whole human being in process. To be seen in one's vulnerability without shame is a profound act of rehumanization. It creates the internal permission to exist fully, all contradictions intact. Ritual, too, plays a powerful role in integration. Not the empty rituals of habit, sacred rituals, conscious acts that mark psychological transformation. This could take the form of journaling, art, meditative practice, or symbolic gestures that give voice to the inner world. These rituals are not about external change, but internal alignment. They allow the unconscious to speak in its native language, that of symbol, image, and metaphor. In these expressions, the fragments of the self begin to weave together into a more coherent whole. Dreams become particularly meaningful in this process. The unconscious does not lecture or moralize, it reveals. In dreams, the addict may encounter archetypal figures, forgotten memories, or recurring symbols. These are not distractions but invitations. Invitations to understand the self from a deeper vantage point. To work with dreams is to enter the theater of the soul, where unresolved tensions play out not to torment, but to instruct. As the dreamer begins to decode the messages, they slowly reclaim aspects of the psyche, once thought lost. Perhaps the most radical aspect of integration is the redefinition of identity. Addiction often creates a fixed self-image. I am broken. I am lost. But these identities are defenses, constructed to manage overwhelming emotion. As integration unfolds, the individual begins to see that they are not their pain, not their addiction, not their trauma. They are the space in which all these experiences have occurred. This realization creates freedom, not freedom from suffering, but freedom within it. One becomes capable of holding sorrow without being consumed by it, of acknowledging darkness without collapsing into it. This capacity to hold complexity is the hallmark of an integrated psyche. It does not demand resolution of all inner conflict, the ability to witness that conflict from a center that is no longer fragmented. The addict in this light is not a failed version of a healthy person. They are someone whose psyche has been forced to split in order to survive. Integration is the slow and sacred act of calling those lost parts home. Addiction is not merely a flaw in behavior or a failure of will. It is a profound psychological struggle, rooted in the unseen dimensions of the self. Beneath every craving is a cry for connection. Beneath every relapse, a revelation of unresolved pain. To understand addiction is not to condemn, but to decode, not to shame, but to illuminate. We have explored the inner mechanics that drive the compulsive need. The dissociation from the self, the repression of the shadow, the archetypal battles within the psyche, and the path of integration that leads toward wholeness. This journey demands courage, not just the strength to resist a substance, but the far greater strength to face what that substance has been masking. It asks us to confront the parts of ourselves we have long feared, to listen to the wounds we have long silenced, and to accept the totality of who we are. Healing begins not with control, but with consciousness. When we turn inward, honestly, vulnerably, we begin to uncover not just the source of our suffering, but the wisdom buried within it. The path out of addiction is not linear, nor is it quick. It is a spiral, a descent and return. It is the slow and sacred task of reuniting with the abandoned self, not to become someone new, to finally become whole,